Hello, everyone. I'm Sally Bachman. I have the great privilege of serving as Dean of the School of Social Policy and Practice. We call ourselves SP2 here at the University of Pennsylvania. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our 6th virtual installment of our annual SP2 speaker series, Conversations about Race, Equity, and Justice with experts on social policy and social work. Today's program, Antisemitism, Racism, and Extremism, will be hosted by Ben Jealous. We're privileged that Ben is a professor of practice at the Annenberg School for Communication, Penn Law School, and also SP2 here at the University of Pennsylvania. He serves as the president of People for the American Way. Ben has an unwavering commitment to social change and racial justice that is in perfect alignment with SP2's mission. When he was selected to head the NAACP at age 35, he became the organization's youngest ever national leader. His family's strong community activism dates back generations, and his SP2 connection traces back many decades to his late, beloved 105-year-old grandmother, who was an SP2 alumna. As we continue to confront the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing issues with racial, social, and economic justice, it continues to be important to explore these topics. This conversation is an example of SP2's dedication to addressing complex social problems through education, research, and civic engagement. And now it gives me great pride to introduce Ben Jealous. Ben?
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Sally. This is a timely conversation. To everyone who's joined us today, if you have a question, and I suspect many of you will, please use the Q&A tab to submit. This weekend, with the massacre in Buffalo, it's a reminder that this conversation about extremism, about anti-Semitism is very, very timely. First, it was Tree of Life and the massacre there. Then it was the massacre in El Paso, first Jews, then Latinos. Massacre in New Zealand of Muslims. Massacre in Buffalo, primarily Black folks. And you end up with a litany that kind of reflects that of Pastor Niebuhr during the Holocaust. First they came forward, then they came forward, then they came forward. It's a reminder that for the haters, their hatred of all these groups is connected. Push their great replacement theory. And they ultimately target all of us, sometimes all at once, sometimes in succession, like these massacres. It's why I'm so pleased that we were already organized to have this conversation with Ms. Burstein. And it's my pleasure to introduce Robin Burstein, who serves as the Deputy Director of the Anti-Defamation League of Philadelphia. Ms. Burstein.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ben. And I also want to thank Jerri Bourjolly for inviting ADL to speak today, and your entire team. Caitlin is going to be sharing my slides, so if you're ready to do that, Caitlin, I am too. It's a fairly short presentation, and there'll be plenty of time for discussion at the end. And I'll just start off for those who are on the call who may not yet know about ADL. Caitlin, can you go to the next slide and play the short video?
Racism isn't only the problem of Black people, it's all our problem. And homophobia isn't the problem. Racism isn't only the problem of Black people, it's all our problem. And homophobia isn't the problem of only gay people, it's all of our problem. Anti-Semitism only isn't an issue for the Jewish community, it is everyone's problem. And we know from history that Jews are the canary in the coal mine.
In 1913, the founders of ADL understood this truth. And then, catalyzed by the lynching of Leo Frank, they embraced a simple yet audacious mission: to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. Hateful anti-Semitic stereotypes in the press, in the public square, in politics, we fought for us all. For Jews, for everyone. The right to vote, regardless of the color of your skin. The right to come to our shores, regardless of what country you hail from. The right to marry, regardless of sexual orientation. The right to be free from harassment, discrimination, or hate, regardless of your differences. Today, ADL continues to fight for us all. ADL is a century-old anti-hate organization, and we have only begun to fight. Against anti-Semitism, against all forms of hate, on the street, online, in the classroom, on campus, in the workplace, from City Hall to the halls of Congress to the halls of power in world capitals. We will continue to fight the hate that harms us all. ADL is the first call when acts of anti-Semitism occur. We are a recognized expert in the study of extremism. We are a worldwide leader in anti-bias education. We are the foremost authority and trailblazer in fighting hate online. And we are a relentless advocate for the civil rights of all. When vulnerable communities are threatened here at home or abroad, we will speak out for them. We will defend Israel's right to exist, calling out those who delegitimize and demonize her. We will expose bigotry for what it is, whether it's cloaked in political rhetoric, academic theories, or calls for boycotts. We don't care how you vote, but we do care what you value. We are principled, not political. We choose action, not sides. We are guided by the words of Hillel: "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am not for others, what am I? And if not now, when?" In 1913, our founders understood that America would only be safe for its Jews if it was safe for all its people. And since then, we have defended American values like dignity, equality, justice, and fair treatment for us all.
Next slide, please. At its core, anti-Semitism boils down to just one simple idea: the Jews are to blame. This slide shows some of the most common anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes. Power, the idea that Jews have some secret power, including control over financial systems, the media, the government, etc., to benefit themselves at the expense of others. This is the trope that we believe motivated the shooter at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh and the hostage taker in Colleyville, Texas. Disloyalty, the idea that Jews are more loyal to themselves or to Israel than to the countries in which they live in. Greed, the idea that Jews will try to enrich themselves by any means. The deicide, the idea that Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. Blood, this is an interesting one, blood. The idea that Jews use Christian blood, particularly the blood of children, in their rituals. We see this trope play out today in conspiracy theories around QAnon and the idea that the blood of children is used by this elite secret cabal of globalists to stay young and healthy. This idea that QAnon is promoting has direct ties back to this anti-Semitic trope. Denial, the idea that Jews made up or exaggerated the Holocaust for personal gain. And disease, the idea that Jews are responsible for or somehow benefit from disease. That Jews invented COVID-19, for example, so that they could benefit from creating the cure, which also plays into the trope on greed, right? So we created COVID-19 so we could create the cure so we could make money off of selling vaccines. Next slide. Anti-Israel bias is extreme and/or illegitimate criticism of Israel, and it can take a variety of forms, including false accusations directed against Israel, often with the aim of delegitimizing the country. Anti-Israel bias does not include legitimate criticism of Israel or the Israeli government, its policies, or its politicians. Israel's a country, just like America is a country, and it is not anti-Semitic to fairly criticize the policies and leaders of the Israeli state. However, there are times when criticism of Israel or anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Human rights activist Natan Sharansky offered this 3Ds framework for understanding when criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti-Zionism. Demonization, applying this classic anti-Semitic trope to Israel using dehumanizing language or imagery. Delegitimization, arguing for the dismantling of the state of Israel, denying Jews the right to self-determination. And double standards, the application of different sets of principles to similar situations in other countries. Next slide. ADL works to combat all forms of hate and extremism across the ideological spectrum. We can't end hate with just one group. As Ben said in his introduction, it is all interrelated. This slide shows just a small sampling of some of the ideologies we encounter. So anti-Semitism fits into many of these ideologies: neo-Nazis, the alt-right, the white supremacists, and left-wing extremists, among others, all adhere to some form of anti-Semitic belief system. Robert Bowers, the man who walked into the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, was an anti-immigrant extremist. A review of his online media post exposed virulent anti-Semitism. These views led to his actions in October of 2018, which was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in US history on Jews. The hostage taker in Colleyville, Texas, in January, called for the release of Afia Siddiqui, a convicted terrorist with links to Al-Qaeda, who railed against Jews during her trial and who had blamed her guilty verdict on Israel. And while we may never really fully understand the hostage taker's thinking, unlike the Pittsburgh murderer who left behind a long manifesto, we don't have evidence that points to his belief system. And now we can add the murderous rampage in Buffalo and his belief system in the Great Replacement Theory. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, more in depth on another slide. And then the same is true for racism, right? We see racism threaded through neo-Nazis and the alt-right and white supremacists. You know, there are the intellectual racists. Racism in America is more unique in the fact that it remains somewhat institutionalized and baked into our systems. Next slide. The systemic inequities in structural racism that we see in housing, employment, education, and healthcare has been exposed during the past few years in a way that many in America had not previously recognized. I recently attended a discussion on racial bias in pain assessment and treatment that was sponsored by Blue Cross Blue Shield. One of the panel members told a story of a girl that was not participating in her physical therapy treatments to recover. So social services were sent in, and over time it was discovered that the patient actually overheard nurses discussing that Black people don't feel pain in the same way that white people do. This was not 30 years ago, or 10 years ago, or even 3. This is still happening this year. And I think it's important to note that this year on Martin Luther King Day, Dr. King's family did not call for a day of service. Instead, they chose to highlight the importance of voting rights and the inequity in voting rights and the importance of ensuring free and fair and equitable elections. And while there has been, many controversial use of force complaints against police, the killing of George Floyd and the conviction of his murderer exposed ongoing bias in our law enforcement systems. Next slide. On January 6th, 2021, a horde of extremists forced their way into the US Capitol, protesting the outcome of a national election and intent on disrupting a time-honored democratic process. ADL Center on Extremism identified more than 200 of the roughly 800 individuals who are believed to have breached the building. 52, or 25% of those folks, were found to have ties to known right-wing extremist groups, including the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the Groupers, QAnon, and other white supremacists. ADL has joined in filing a federal lawsuit to hold the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and their leaders and members accountable for their actions in planning and carrying out the January 6th attack. Our CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt, was quoted as saying, ADL has been at the forefront of strategically monitoring, exposing, and countering extremist threats from across the ideological spectrum for decades. We have deep expertise when it comes to groups and individuals involved in the planning and execution of the January 6th attack, and are honored now to be putting that expertise at the full service of the District of Columbia and the brave officers who were injured or killed as a result of that day. So just to clarify and give you a little bit of background, the Proud Boys represent an unconventional strain of American right-wing extremism. They can be described as violent, nationalistic, Islamophobic, transphobic, and misogynistic. Its members represent a range of ethnic backgrounds, and its leaders vehemently protest any allegations of racism. The Oath Keepers are a large, loosely organized collection of right-wing anti-government extremists who are part of a militia movement that believes that the federal government has been co-opted by a shadowy conspiracy that is trying to strip American citizens of their rights. Though the Oath Keepers will accept anyone as members, what differentiates them from other anti-government extremist groups is they have an explicit focus on recruiting current and former military, law enforcement, and first responder personnel. Next slide, please. And if you listen to podcasts, you might want to listen to the New York Times podcast entitled The Daily. It's actually one of my favorites. There was a two-part series that aired on November 16th and 17th last year, focused on school board meetings, and particularly the school board meetings in Central Bucks, Pennsylvania, right here in our own backyard, where the meetings have been particularly contentious. The free expression of ideas and viewpoints is vital for any community to learn, thrive, and grow. During the school board meetings, it's important and constitutionally protected right that members of the school's community are able to voice their opinions and perspectives. At the same time, this free expression can and has resulted in extreme bias-based behavior and statements. There are a variety of things that school boards can do to help promote a safe environment and convey messages of inclusivity to the community. One of our resources that we put out recently, entitled Extremists and Contentious Behavior at School Board Meetings, What You Can Do, outlines suggestions that school boards and their members can take to counter biased speech, no matter what the source or the ideology. Next slide. Critical race theory, or what's commonly called CRT, is taught primarily in higher education and law school, I'm sure I don't have to explain to the folks on this call. It's the study of how laws and policies can drive and perpetuate racial disparities and inequities. And even though critical race theory is not taught in K through 12 schools, absolutely not, there are some using misinformation and fear to drive a wedge between people. Challenging and banning children's books, unfortunately, is nothing new. The American Library Association has a website focused on book banning, and there's an annual Banned Books Week that celebrates the freedom to read. This current book banning trend that we're seeing is particularly concerning because it's targeted and specific. Parents, schools, and districts are using CRT as a boogeyman to justify banning books that help students understand the impact of racism in systemic discrimination and oppression. In recent months, works of children's literature, particularly those written by Black authors, are increasingly being questioned, challenged, and banned amid the CRT debate. Of the most challenged books, 6 out of 10 are about race and racism and or by authors of color, most of whom are Black. We cannot let this anti-CRT measures prevent educators from teaching about important topics through the lens of children's literature. In addition to exploring different identities and perspectives, these books help teach the truth of our history, reflect on current events, and show how bias and injustice show up, and illustrate how people can take actions to overcome it. Next slide, please. A sense of grievance lies at the heart of every extremist movement. And right now, many extremists believe the election, or more broadly, their rights as Americans, have been or are being stolen by actors of a far-reaching left-wing globalist conspiracy. And in this backdrop of swirling disinformation, there is this sense of loss, that something rightfully earned was taken away. And this both animates and ignites those who feel wronged. The justification to act out against these wrongs is perceived not only as justified, but necessary. Next slide, please. The murderous attack in Buffalo on Saturday resulted in 10 dead, 3 injured, and countless families and community members that are now changed forever. It was the latest in a long line of attacks that can be referred to simply by their city names: Oak Creek, Charleston, Orlando, Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso, Buffalo. As the first reports of the attack surfaced, ADL's Center on Extremism and our researchers and analysts uncovered and analyzed intelligence about the shooter's background and ideology, including examining his weapons, his manifesto, his social media activity, and more. We also monitored extremist chatter to watch for additional threats and to identify trends in extremist reactions. We share our relevant intelligence with law enforcement to support their investigation at all levels, federal, state, and local levels. Our education team developed a resource to assist educators and parents in discussing the attack with young people. If you go on adl.org/ type in attack in Buffalo, you'll find a whole page of resources. The National Urban League, us, the Anti-Defamation League, the League of United Latin American Citizens, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the National Action Network have all joined together to urge President Biden to convene a summit to confront the threat of domestic terrorism. And we will continue to advocate for the immediate passage of the bipartisan Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, which seeks to address the growing threat of white supremacist groups and other violent domestic extremists. Next slide. White supremacist propaganda, which allows extremist groups to disseminate hateful, hurtful messages and gain attention with little risk of public exposure, has been on the rise for several years. There were 4,851 cases reported in 21, and the high number of anti-Semitic propaganda incidents has continued into 2022. In 2021, propaganda was reported in every state in our country except Hawaii. The highest levels of activity were right here in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania accounted for 473 pieces of propaganda, white supremacist, anti-Semitic propaganda. The next highest state was Virginia with 375. That's almost 100 incidents less. And then this year, in 2022, we're seeing the Anti-Semitic Goyim Defense League dropping anti-Semitic leaflets on college campuses and across entire neighborhoods, with incidents reported in at least 16 states, including Pennsylvania. Next slide. Most of the propaganda in Pennsylvania is distributed by two groups, Patriot Front and the New Jersey Heritage Association. Patriot Front is a white supremacist group whose members maintain that their ancestors conquered America and bequeathed it solely to them. They espouse racism and anti-Semitism and intolerance under the guise of preserving the ethnic and cultural origins of their European ancestors. They fuse extreme patriotism with a neo-fascist ideology. The New Jersey European Heritage Association espouses racism, anti-Semitism, and intolerance under the guise of, quote, saving white European peoples from purported imminent extinction. Members hold the white supremacist worldview that unless immediate action is taken, the white race is doomed to extinction by, quote, a rising tide of color purportedly controlled and manipulated by Jews. Let's just talk about this theory. This is the theory. This is that great replacement theory, right? That white people are being replaced by people of color in a conspiracy that's controlled by Jews, is the theory that motivated the guy this weekend in Buffalo. Going back to the New Jersey European Heritage Association, they are actually responsible for much of the flyering that we see on college campuses in our region. And as I talk and mention, you know, these different extremists and extremist groups, there are backgrounders for, if you're anyone who's interested, much more in depth on our website for anybody who might want to learn more. Next slide, please. Terrorists and extremist groups actively try to recruit new members to join their causes in a variety of ways. And the internet and social media have been a powerful tool in their arsenal, especially when trying to entice young people to their cause. They use websites and social media platforms to share propaganda, spread disinformation and misinformation, and to foster a sense of community among their supporters. They become friends with people who seem to display any amount of interest in what they're sharing, doing, or saying. Newcomers might feel that they become a part of a community with these extremist friends online and feel like these new online friends are real friends. They don't realize that the extremists don't like them for who they are, but rather they're just trying to take advantage of them to further the goals of the extremist group. Some people can forget why extremism and terrorism are evil and begin to believe that their new friends have legitimate viewpoints. And over time, they may come to believe that they have no choice but to use or advocate for the use of violence. It's an internet-wide problem. When Twitter bans folks from its platform, we see surges in accounts like created on Gab, which is known as the white supremacist Twitter. Gab is also the platform that the Pittsburgh shooter used to promote his anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant views. Next slide, please. I want to click it again so it populates. Somebody else put that together all the way up. Let's see if we can populate the entire pyramid there. Thank you. So what can you do? At ADL, we use the tool called the pyramid of hate. So if we allow biased attitudes to go unchecked, that very bottom level of the pyramid, you know, that can become normalized, and then people can start acting on those attitudes. And when individual acts of bias go unchecked, they too can become normalized, and societies can start adopting systemic discrimination. And when discrimination goes unchecked and becomes normalized, it allows for more and more individual and systemic expressions of hate to become possible. The good news here is that we can interrupt the escalation of hate before it goes too far. At each level of the pyramid, you can interrupt the escalation of hate, but you have to do it specifically and targeted based on what is happening. If you respond inappropriately, you can inadvertently accelerate the progression along the pyramid. So for example, we can't respond to a biased joke the same way we respond to a hate crime. It'll backfire and people's biases may become hardened. At the lower levels of the pyramid, we want to meet words and ideas with counter speech and education. And I'll say this, it's bolded in my notes, and I'll say this as clearly as I can. If you feel safe, certainly do not interrupt and speak up if you don't feel safe. We do not recommend you put yourself in harm's way. But if you feel safe, interrupt an incident and state your opposition to the bias. And it doesn't have to be done in a cruel, mean, and harmful way. You can interrupt and say, hey, do you realize what you just said is this age-old anti-Semitic stereotype against, name whatever community you want to protect in that moment? That's not true, and here's why. And you know, you saying things like that perpetuate it. I'd really appreciate it as you, my friend, move forward, that you don't repeat those stereotypes. Just something calm like that. Next slide, please. So what can you do? Stay engaged. If you don't, you allow others to take over the narrative. And we have seen what happens when people are ill-informed and frustrated. I think we have a minute. This is only a couple of minutes long. Caitlin, can you show the video on the Protect plan for me, please?
On January 6th, Americans watched as an insurrection fueled by violent conspiracy theories, anti-government fervor, and white supremacy attacked the seat of our democracy. Driven by years of escalating and increasingly public displays of extremism, the attack on the Capitol was arguably the most predictable terrorist incident in modern American history. The forces that fueled the attack on our Capitol continue to pose a threat to American security and democracy. In response to that event, and in an effort to address the overall increase in domestic terrorism while protecting civil liberties, ADL is announcing the Protect Plan. The 7 facets of Protect will significantly mitigate the threat of domestic terrorism, more so than any one policy or law, and would do so while protecting vulnerable people and communities against the risk of government overreach. The Protect Plan priorities include adopting an approach that includes actions for federal, state, and local officials, as well as the tech industry. Passing the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act to authorize offices to address domestic terrorism and ensure those offices have resources proportionate to the threat, taking steps to ensure that individuals associated with violent extremist movements or engaged in violent extremist activity are deemed unsuitable for employment at the federal, state, and local levels, including law enforcement and military, and not given security clearances. Funding civil society programs to address violent extremist radicalization and recruitment, while ensuring these programs do not stigmatize communities. Investigating any complicity between social media companies and extremists, and make social media platforms more transparent and accountable for dangerous content. Domestic terrorism is a threat that impacts everyone. Call on policymakers to act now. Extremism must end now.
Next slide, please. What else can you do? Vote. ADL strongly condemned the failure of the Senate to pass the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. The Senate's failure to enact this vital legislation leaves the touchstone of our democracy, free, fair, and accessible elections, vulnerable to ongoing assault, not only from violent extremists and conspiracy theorists, but also by state laws that are designed to suppress the vote and interfere with the fair administration of elections. ADL, as we often do, has worked with other prominent civil rights organizations, the NAACP, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, in urging leaders in the business community to speak up in support of legislation that would protect and enhance voting rights. We will continue to fight for the integrity of our voting system and against voting measures that will have a discriminatory impact. But what I want you to do is vote. Vote and advocate for free and fair elections across the United States. Next slide. And as we conclude, I just want to share the richness of ADL's online education resources and encourage you to explore them. ADL.org/education has lesson plans for educators, table talks for parents to have family discussions with their kids, and a variety of all other kinds of amazing resources available for you to download and use. Next slide, please. The challenges are great. We are called yet again to fulfill ADL's mission, to fight the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. These goals are complementary. If you want Jews to live without fear in the United States, you should march for equality and justice for Black people, Latinos, and all Americans. And if you believe that America needs to work harder to deliver equity and justice to all its people, then you should stand with us against anti-Semitism, regardless of where it originates. So thank you again for having me speak. Caitlin, can you stop the share and then we can move on and answer some questions.
Thanks again, Robin. You know, as you were talking, it was hard not to reflect on what the tragedy in Buffalo reminds us about where our country is right now and how fragile it is. We have three questions, two from Hannah, who I'll give you both her questions at once. Can you share a bit more about what you mean by left-wing extremism, and how do you hold space for criticism of Israel's treatment of Palestine and Palestinians?
Sure. Left-wing extremism, you know, there's extremists, if you look at a bell curve, right? There's extremists on the right and extremists on the left, and then there's the main group in the middle, you know, the centrist. So in every situation, there are folks that have extreme views, no matter what the topic is, you know, on the left and on the right. And so that's where, when we talk about left, I'm not talking about left and right politically, I'm talking about left and right, like ideology wise. if we're talking about Israel and Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, if you want to criticize a particular policy about that, that is not anti-Semitic, not at all. But if you then say, you know, Jews are, you know, controlling, you know, if you use it to demonize all Jews, if you use it to demonize the entire state and not call out the particular policy that's in question, that's where you draw the line into anti-Semitism. And Israel, just like America, is not a perfect state. They have said things and done things that ADL has spoken out about. You know, it really depends on who's in leadership in any particular moment. I happen to like the leadership there right now in their coalition government. But just like any other country, you know, they make mistakes.
Talia asks, what's the difference between free speech and hate speech and ensuring it does not lead to violence?
So hate speech is free speech, right? And I am not a constitutional scholar and I am not a lawyer, so I'm not going to be able to give you the legality of that. I can say that ADL is a strong proponent of free speech, and including folks who want to share their horrific belief systems. We believe that the best way to counteract hate speech is with good speech, right? When you hear someone saying something that's inappropriate, whether it be a stereotype or something, you know, biased or really completely inflammatory, if you can, share why what they said was inappropriate. Talk to them. The best way to counteract hate speech is by using your voice and your speech to counteract those messages.
Jeffrey asks, what is ADL's response to the Harvard Crimson editorial board's endorsement of BDS?
You know, I saw a lot flying around on that. We were not happy with their endorsement of BDS because, so BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. Most of the people involved in the BDS movement, from what we can ascertain from the studies we have done, really want fair and treatment of Palestinians. However, the leaders of the BDS movement, folks like Omar Baghouti and his cronies, are actually calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. So when you support BDS, and there are many things that you can support to speak out for fair treatment of Palestinians, but when you support BDS, you're supporting someone or the organization itself who at its heart, at its core, is calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. And ADL is completely against that.
Question from Jarrell. I live in Central Bucks, where you referred to in your presentation, and I can speak specifically about my own and other rabbis there who are clearly fearful or resistant to speak out against anti-Semitic, racist, homophobic school board actions because there is a sense from them that this is a political rather than hateful situation. How can ADL step in and assist?
So if we're talking about Central Bucks in particular?
Yeah.
So today, and it was posted on Facebook, it's on their website. It may have been yesterday that he posted it. The superintendent of Central Bucks actually put out a big, long explanation as to what is going on in Central Bucks right now. And it's a variety of issues. And according to the superintendent, I just read it this morning, so don't quote me on exactly what was said. And I only read it once. According to the superintendent, the teacher who has recently been put on suspension was put on suspension not because he aided an LGBTQ student, but for other reasons. According to the superintendent, them taking, them saying they took down the pride flags is because it has become a political symbol and is no longer a symbol of supporting our LGBTQ plus friends. And so it's very interesting and it's very complex, because then you hear from parents and community members who say that there are all kinds of incidents and things happening. I myself watched one of the school board meetings, I want to say way back in like October, November, where 3 different people got up and were allowed to speak. And again, they're allowed to speak. One of them promoted horrific racist stuff. One of them promoted really anti-Semitic stuff. And one of them was extremely, homophobic. And not once, and they let them speak and they gave them their time, which they have to do. But my argument for that is not one single school board member, after any of those people spoke, took the mic and said, "We appreciate that you shared your views. Your views do not reflect our school. They do not reflect our community, and they have no place in our school district or community." Next speaker. No one spoke up and did what I'm begging you to do, that if you hear something that's inappropriate, that you use your voice and you negate what was said, and you make sure that the people who have been attacked know that you're protecting them, right? It boggles me that no one on the school board shared that those opinions are not representative of the school. So there's a lot going on there. So I will share with you, ADL is working with the NAACP of Bucks County, the ACLU, Campaign for Our Shared Futures, and some other partners in putting together, convening some parents around what's going on in Bucks County, and not only Central Bucks School District, but Penn Ridge School District and Pennsbury School District. A lot of them are having issues. And we will be working, like I said, with our partners and convening a group of parents and seeing where our expertise and help can be of best use.
It's a very lively chat. So we have some more questions. Next one is from Elizabeth. She says, "I'm seeing a lot of school libraries feeling pressure to ban young adult children's literature that has any content that could be banned, including Black and people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, the LGBTQ community, and the Jewish-owned voices writers. Is there anything the ADL is doing or could do to help counteract these measures? A lot of young adult has representation for these own voices, which is wonderful."
Yeah, we're trying to educate community members about what they can do when it comes to their school districts and their school systems. Some of the things that we've seen across the country, when books are removed from schools, the local library then posts that they have them available, right? So the community then responds. We do believe it is up to each individual parent what their children get exposed to, right? And there are certain things that are age appropriate and potentially age inappropriate. However, we also believe that it's up to the parents in that school district to speak out and let their values be heard, and make sure that the resources and educational materials that do not erase our history and do not exclude all students and identities are available to our students. And so it is an area that we, again, partner on. That's part of the discussion that we're having that I just mentioned in Bucks County, with the partnership that we've created. But those kinds of partnerships and those kinds of responses are happening across the country, and ADL is involved in a partner, but we're not necessarily leading the charge on the book ban issue.
Hannah says, "Thank you for what you shared." She asked the questions earlier. She was wondering a bit about the examples of left-wing extremism. She says that she hasn't seen much, if any, examples of hate speech or hate crimes from left-wing groups. Just think we want to be mindful and not equate right-wing extremism with left-wing extremism as being the same when she's not sure that they are, and would love to hear your thoughts.
I agree. They're not. They're absolutely not. But left-wing extremism can lead to some horrific behaviors also. Right now, so ADL, and again, I'm talking off the top of my head, so don't quote me 100%, but we produce a document called Murder and Extremism in the United States every year. It comes out in January. You'd be able to find it on our website. 75% of murders over the last 10 or 15 years have been by right-wing extremists. You know, left-wing extremists who may espouse some hateful views do cause harm. So let's put BDS in that category, or I'm drawing a blank right now, but there's a variety of others that are extremely liberal to the point where then it leaves some groups out. Left-wing extremism is bad. Right-wing extremism is killing us. They are not equatable, but they are both harmful, and they both need to be addressed and interrupted.
Amen. The Caroline writes, thank you for the workshop. Someone who's now a senior activist who was in the battles of the 1960s. It's challenging to see where we are today. It's challenging not to get discouraged, keep young folks motivated and hopeful. Do you have any thoughts for Caroline?
It's hard, right? Like, look at the turnout and some of the polling that was done yesterday during elections about people not caring anymore or just being overwhelmed or burned out with these issues. It's really hard. We need to teach our young people how to interact, in civil society, how to advocate for appropriate legislation, how to stand up for what they believe in, how to be allies. I mean, that's all the work of ADL. We've got tons of resources on that. But, we need to work through the systems we have, the school systems, the faith communities, any system that we have in order to reach our young people and get them engaged in what's going on. The problem is, not enough people are interested at this moment. They're kind of burned out. Listen, we've all gone through the last couple of years, of COVID and all of these, restrictions and issues, and people are tired and burned out. But for those of us who have the motivation and have the energy, we do need to start to talk to our networks and get them excited about participating in civil society. And again, I'll refer you to the ADL website. All you have to do is, type in a keyword on the search, and there are a ton of educational resources that you can use to share with others on that topic.
Amen. Amen. Well, Robin, I really want to thank you for this conversation today and taking all the questions. And, that last question from Caroline reminds me of something that my grandmother used to say.
Excuse me.
Went to Penn in the early 1950s before Brown. And I think in some ways was surprised by the kind of jaded posture of so many students in elite universities in the Ivy League. She would say, pessimists are right more often, but optimists win more often. She would liken life to a boxing match. So the pessimist gets in the round and gets in the ring and throws in the towel by the fourth round because the perspective is, if I get in this fight, I'm going to get knocked down, and get knocked down 3 rounds in a row, they give up. The optimist gets in every round saying, this might be the round I don't get knocked down.
Mm-hmm.
Ever mindful that you only have to be the last person standing at the end of all 12. Well, that's how Muhammad Ali won the Rumble in the jungle against George Foreman. He's got in every single round, planning simply to be standing at the end of the 12th, not worrying how many times he got knocked down in between. And she would say, you know, in this life, you have to choose what's more important to you, to win more often or to be right more often. As for her, she would always choose winning. And I want to thank you, your colleagues at the ADL, for choosing to stay focused on winning the battle over extremism in our country. God bless you for that.
Thank you.
And now it's my pleasure to bring back our Associate Dean, Jerri Bourjolly, to close us out. Jerri?
Thank you, Ben and Robin, for this incredibly informative, critical, and necessary discussion today. As SB2's Associate Dean for Inclusion, I want to emphasize that conversations like this one are vital to our school's mission. This is a prime example of the kind of necessary dialogue we continue to encourage in our community. SB2 remains steadfast in its commitment to anti-Semitism, anti-racism, intersectionality, inclusion, diversity, and social justice within our 5-degree programs and throughout all our interactions with colleagues, students, alumni, and our external partners. I invite everyone to learn more about our work by visiting our SB2 inclusion page, and we have shared a link in the chat. Thank you to everyone who has also joined us today. I look forward to hosting future events here at SB2. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.